everybody. My name is Successful, founder and CEO of the Minority Psychology Network, and we're back with another podcast of Breaking the Stigma, here with my co-host, O'Neill.
This is the Culture Therapy, y'all.
Yes, so we have a very interesting topic today. We're talking about cultural trauma. We're also going to touch on racial trauma, and we have very special guests that's here today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So we'll start with you, Dominique.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dominique Lloyd. I am a third-year doctoral student at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, studying clinical forensic psychology. I'm also a chair of the Spirituality Committee with MPN, as well as the Outreach Committee.
Great, thank you. What about you, Eka?
Hi, my name is Eka. I am an associate managing family therapist with the California BBS, and I am a board member of the Minority Psychology Network, as well as a part of the VIT committee, planning committee.
All right, great. All right, so let's just jump right into it. Let's do it. So what is cultural trauma?
2020 and 2021, no, but
basically
that can sum it up in one package. But no, cultural trauma is a form of trauma that is experienced. It could either be by certain cultures in particular, like if they're targeted. It could be from environmental trauma and socioeconomic status based on that culture's surroundings and environment, as I mentioned. It could be generational trauma that is, coming from that culture in particular. There's an array of things that can be there to describe what cultural trauma is.
That's interesting. I've always wondered in terms of just, the overall kind of effects that can have, like you said, on a whole community. What are kind of those effects, of course, if we talk about, police brutality or it doesn't matter if it's, immigration for the Hispanic community, certain things like that, what effects can that have on, parents and their kids and what that conversation might look like in terms of, how that generational kind of trauma affects the older generation down to the younger generation,
I think the effects that it could, give me 1 second. Dominique, I'm gonna let you pick that one up because I got a little background going on here.
In terms of the effects, I think it's important to understand that, communal trauma, racial, cultural trauma, they all have like a collective onset of effects and consequences that come up from that. And that's because ideally the person reality is turned upside down. So they can have psychological, relational, spiritual consequences that is related to that. And furthermore, when it comes to your question, when it talks about generational, a lot of times we don't understand how the effects of one traumatic experience or a collective of traumatic experience shapes the way we act and how we function on a day-to-day basis. So now my worldview is shaped differently because I've experienced police brutality. And now I'm gonna teach my kids now, this is how you act when a police approach you, and instead of having that that blank view that we usually have before we deal with our own trauma related to anything. Now we're acting in a certain way because of that trauma experience.
Okay.
So it's interesting that you brought up the police brutality. So is there like a difference between racial trauma and, cultural trauma, being that, we feel that the Black and brown people are more targeted when it comes to police brutality?
I think the cultural trauma is kind of embedded together. When you think of a culture, when you think of Black and brown communities, that is part of our trauma, is the police brutality, is our approach towards the police. Those two cultures in particular have different outlooks about the police than, maybe some of our Caucasian or Asian counterparts. So that's a part of that racial, cultural trauma, those differences there.
I think, I mean, to piggyback on what you said, I think it goes deeper because as African Americans, we have slavery, and that basically is the start of our trauma. Like everything that we know, from Jim Crow to everything, the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we approach one another, even though we're not like formulated as a group, it's different than other cultures. And I think that's, you know, really important that we should look at as well.
As you know, professionals, and speaking to, like, you know, LPCs and things like that, how do you combat that, understanding that trauma that comes from this specific community? What do you say to clients that, you know, are being affected? I mean, depression is up right now. Depression is up, anxieties and things like that, and it's stemming from a lot of these, you know, like, you know, on the subject of police brutality, just this basic fear. You know, how do you diagnose this? How do you kind of, you know, move through the topical kind of current events while still maintaining that understanding of psychology? Like, you know, basically, how do you speak to your clients?
I think it's important to address the symptoms always before you're addressing like a specific diagnosis. And that's with any diagnosis. You know, address what those symptoms are, because they're going to always look different in different people. What I've been doing with my clients the past couple of weeks is, like, besides us just talking about whatever the reasons are for coming to therapy, is just really talking about the reality of the atmosphere. And I've noticed all of my clients have just been feeling really heavy about all the things that they've been taking in, you know, on social media and the news, and just even in their own communities, you know, because there's so much stuff that we don't see on an everyday basis that we don't see on social media. So there's trauma that's occurring in these communities with our clients that isn't even being talked about, which is also part of the problem too. It's almost, you know, like they don't matter, like we don't matter. So I think that's traumatic in itself.
Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead,
Dominique. No, you can go, successful.
Well, it's pretty much the same question, but in a different form. I just wanted to touch on how Brian talked about depression, anxiety, you know, feelings of fear and feelings of helplessness. What are some other diagnoses that could come from, you know, cultural, racial trauma?
I mean, other than PTSD.
Right. Could you talk a little bit about PTSD?
I mean, PTSD is just post-traumatic stress disorder. It's basically diagnosed when an individual has experienced a traumatic event that they might have reoccurring thoughts, reoccurring nightmares, things that trigger them because of that event. To piggyback on the original question, I think for me, I'm also a substance abuse counselor. So a lot of times when I'm dealing with my clients, I think of racial injustice that occurred through the Black community when it comes to crack. Like, I have a lot of older clients who are still having the effects of crack. And I mean, we just had DMX who passed away from substance abuse, and Shock G. So I kind of empathize with them in a tremendous way, as well as them being homeless, dealing with a lot of injustice that goes on in the streets. Like, you'll hear so many clients that talk about like things that go on, and you're like, wow, I didn't think in a homeless community this would be as affected and that segregated still. So definitely, like I could say, treating the depression and all those things before I can even move on to the illicit drugs that they're abusing.
I was gonna say, Dominique, you made a great point, and like I want to even touch further on that. You know, we talk about the crack epidemic, but then what led up to in the 90s now is mass incarceration. And right. So with mass incarceration, now you're taking out a huge chunk of the population that's now, they're indoctrinated basically. And, have you ever had a client, and this goes to Eka as well, y'all ever had to deal with a client that's coming out, has done, 10, 15, and off of maybe some very minor charges or whatever. But of course, once you're in that system for so long, you become indoctrinated. You almost fall back into the system of crime or poverty, you know, what kind of techniques, or how do you kind of approach those kinds of clients that have gone through that kind of trauma?
I mean, one thing is to remember is how they're trying to adapt back to this new society. You know, society as it once was is different now that they're coming out. And then what's very unfortunate too is like a lot of the recidivism homes and like anti-recidivism, I think it's what it's called, or like a lot of different homes that are like halfway houses, if you will. They're placed back into these same communities where they were coming from. And so it's almost like they're set up for failure and don't have the opportunity to grow or see anything different. So then what do? Revert back to the same things that they knew. The same people who are in the community, you know, the access that they have to a place that they know. So those type of techniques to work with them is sometimes it's a little disheartening because it's some things are out of your control. Like, you know, if that's where they have to live and that's the only place they have, you know, you have to start there and hopefully give them some good coping skills and good other resources that they can access since they'll still be in the same environments.
Okay.
I would definitely mention like motivational interviewing, implementing that change, that mindset of, even though you're in this situation, you just came out doing a long bid, you still have the opportunity to change. Your whole life can change in front of you, and you can be an inspiration to others, as well as like instilling, like she said, coping skills, relaxation skills, because when you're tempted in that moment, yes, you might be quote unquote free, but being in a halfway house, you still have dealing with that energy, dealing with still having to protect your stuff, curfew, things like that, that can be stressful. So just understanding how you can now implement these skills on the outside.
You kind of, when you said the word change, it kind of made me think a little bit about how cultural trauma can definitely affect generations as well. So how do you talk to, you know, your kids about, you know, what's actually happening in their community?
Like kids in our families or kids that we're working with, or a little bit of both?
Both, yeah, both.
Well, for my daughter in particular, she's so young, it's hard to have that conversation with her. But I think I mentioned this even in the last one, like I don't play like cop games. Like I don't like her to play police games or even watch police things, because God forbid she'd be out in the community and, you know, all of a sudden it's mistaken for something else and it, you know, just goes completely left. So, but having that conversation with my clients, you know, the young ones in particular, especially those who are already a part of maybe like probation and juvenile justice, for them, they're so in this mindset, like, you know, the society doesn't care about them and police don't care about them. So it can be difficult having those discussions, but I think now kids are starting to see more and don't really take it as you're just trying to be a parent or trying to be, you know, chastise me. They're starting to see the things in the injustice, and it's making them want to make active changes within themselves. So I think although it's negative stuff that they're seeing in social media, it's making like a positive impact on what they need to change and the things they want to improve on for themselves.
For me, I don't really have any experience working with kids, but I guess as a personal experience, my mom talked to me about these things at a very, very young age. She made me read the Jim Crow letter multiple times. She was not playing any games, I think, because she experienced so much police brutality and other racial things growing up in Philadelphia that immediately, as soon as my comprehension level, she felt like was at a necessary level where I can comprehend, she immediately attacked it. So I was very aware at it at a very early age.
Actually, I want to add to this because it's interesting. This just happened to me. It's on a personal level. That, you know, of course, as a male, my dad has had that conversation with me when I was younger, especially when I was a teenager, you know, about how to interact with police and things like that. You know, a conversation that I will, you know, obviously, you know, non-Black or brown people not necessarily need to have that conversation with their sons. And it's just so, it was sad, man, because I got that conversation again, literally like a week ago. And my dad was on the phone with me, and I could just hear in his voice that he was scared. He's straight up scared. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm 26 years old, but he still has to have this conversation with me. He's like, please don't do, you know, if you're doing whatever. So, like, you know, Eka, do you have a son?
No, I have godsons and they're teenagers, but I don't have a child son.
Isn't it I mean, in your family, is that conversation different? If they're too young, you know, obviously, are you planning to have that conversation? If you do, or when you do, what's it going to look like?
You know, so my godsons are my best friend. That's her children, and you know, she recently had this discussion with them like last year, because especially as things were unfolding, and then a particular situation happened in their community with a former police officer who basically assaulted young children. Like a child went to his house by accident. He thought he called him a porch bandit and basically pulled out a gun on him and threatened the kid, and the kid ran away. But this was my godson's friend. Nevertheless, she had to have that discussion with him about, you know, being mindful that everyone doesn't appreciate our culture, everyone doesn't appreciate the color of our skin and the differences that we all encompass, you know, from various cultures across the board. And so with that, we have to be more careful about the places we go. We have to, you know, watch our surroundings, be mindful of the people we keep in our circles, and then understand that their parents, their grandparents may not feel the same way about them as your friend might feel about you. And so it was a very hard conversation she had to have. She did an excellent job at it, but it was so, you know, again, disheartening to have to even see that, and then know that there was someone in the community who was not on duty, you know, who was not actually doing anything to protect someone who was being, you know, a victim of theft or assault, but, you know, just feeling trigger happy. You know, thank God he didn't pull it, but he pulled it out. And this child who was, he was Hispanic, he had to experience that and see that. And he didn't know what was going on, didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And he wasn't. He just went to the wrong house. Thought he was going to my godson's house and went to his house. And so those are the type of conversations you have to have. And sometimes they happen after unfortunate situations like that occur.
You know, that kind of reminded me of the incident that just happened recently where the young Black male was walking in a neighborhood, and the white guy pretty much told him that he doesn't belong in the neighborhood. You know what I'm talking about?
He's an Army vet, or he was, all right, yeah, I remember seeing that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what do you guys thoughts on that? Because the whole community came out and then stood on his lawn, you know, making a statement.
Yeah, they spotted up, definitely.
In this community, they have a Facebook, so there were people definitely speaking up on Facebook. This child's dad went to his home and talked to him, and he was very hesitant to come outside, but he did go to his home and talk to him and let him know who he was. And other people in the community, I think they just kind of posted it on their Facebook chats, because this was at the beginning of the pandemic, so people weren't really going outside to even feel comfortable enough to do that. But there was some community alliance to let it be known that what you're doing is not right.
Wow, that's really good. Do you think these days, Black people or Black and brown people are doing something different to show that they're, like, you know, fed up with this treatment that we've been dealing with for so long? Do you think, you know, things that they're doing now or presently that kind of mimics what, you know, MLK was doing, you think that's making a difference?
I think, yeah, definitely education and just speaking out and being peaceful about it. Because I think we have that negative connotation of just being violent and acting out and being rude, but we're really just taking that stand of the evidence is speaking for itself. So we're just going to continue to keep posting it or keep talking about, keep having these uncomfortable conversations, because it's no need for us to further explain when the evidence is there. Like, this is, the mistreatment is there. Like, it doesn't need to be justified, and that nothing else needs to occur. We're just gonna keep putting it in your face so you can see it for yourself.
See, I think that, not maybe not the biggest difference, but what I'm seeing and what I'm like to see, and thankfully we've seen that Derek Chauvin has been, he's charged and that justice has been served on him, and for, of course, George Floyd. But like, I think that what we need to understand, just past, of course, the protesting, past the social media movements and things like that, is we have to understand that we need to make sure that accountability is heard. That's what people need to understand about the justice thing. It's not necessarily that George Floyd, of course, it's irrelevant what was in his system and things like that. What the problem was is that anyone else that would have done that to George Floyd would have went to jail. It was just because it was a police officer that was protected and was protected by the system that allowed, and obviously it happens across the nation, that we hold these people accountable. We cannot just hold hands and walk and march down the streets. That's great, that's awesome, but that's more, if you think about it, that's marketing. That's we're pretty much we're showing our frustration. Now we got to make sure that every single one of these cops are held accountable. Every single one. And I'm talking about not just the cop, I'm talking about the department, I'm talking about the police chief, I'm talking about the politicians, I'm talking about the mayor, talking about the DA, everybody. That's where it needs to go. That's the next step in terms of what we do and how we heal, basically, as a community, in my own opinion.
That and the civilians, like the kid, walking down the street and during the George Floyd protest with his gun just open. There's no way, like, Brian, you would never, you couldn't, Dominique, none of us could absolutely walk out with any type of rifle, anything, just the other day, mistaking a phone for a gun, that incident that happened too, or, and there's always this, for me, it's always this thought, did you really mistake it for that? Or is that just the alibi you were going to use to have right after, because some things are just like, they're clear, and so, but yeah.
A taser doesn't hold like, or doesn't feel like a gun. I'm just going to throw that out there as well.
But it's important that you said that. I was driving home and I saw a sign that says, without accountability, there is no change. Like, point blank, period. Point blank, period. Like, exactly. So we have to definitely make sure we're following through. That's the most important thing. It's not we're going to have this conversation and then let it die out for a lack of attention. No, let's circle back. Like how they did Breonna Taylor. Let's circle back. Okay, we got him. Let's circle back. Let's find new evidence.
That should be in the news now, to be honest. We should be mobilizing now for Breonna Taylor.
And it just makes me think about the people that were actually there during, the things that were happening, during the crimes that was committed. Just think about the type of trauma that they're experiencing, feeling helpless, like they can't really do anything because, this is a white man, so, what can I do? They're going to hurt me too, things like that. And then just listening to their interviews in court and on the news about, the different comments that they've received on social media, like, oh, you should have done this, you should have acted like this, being in that situation. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
To me, that just kind of goes back to the cultural trauma just in general, like think about back in the 90s and, we have cell phones now, we have video recording, we have people who come out and, have all these things to show so that we're informed about how many things are happening across the world. But again, like, if nobody was recording Rodney King from wherever they were back then, we wouldn't have known about that. That man would have went home to his family, told them what happened, and then that would have been it, the countless things. How many times we drive down the street and we see people pulled over and we only could wonder, like, what's happening over there? And then there's that part of you that's like, you want to stop, but then it's like, what's going to happen to you, you're thinking about your family. Like there's just so much, and that's where all the paranoia, the anxiety, you know, and then the depression of just feeling helpless and hopeless and being unable to, you know, provide or support or protect your communities and your families as we would like to do. So when they talk about our communities looking so impoverished and looking like we don't care, no, we feel like we're outnumbered. You know, we feel like we don't have the ability to make those moves, because if we do, as close as we get, we're liable to be killed and never see our families or our communities again. So.
It's wild you say that, Edgar, because like nowadays, I mean, I'm finding myself whenever I see a police, you know, pulling someone over, or if I'm walking down the street and I see them around and someone might be handcuffed, I got my phone out, man. Like, you just never know if you're in that situation where it could become a George Floyd. It could become, you know, whoever the next person that gets, you know, murdered on the street by the police. And so you're absolutely right. And that's, I need people to really understand what that means in terms of what the Black community has, that type of trauma, in terms of, if we're on the discussion of police brutality, is that for so long, we could not trust the police. For so long, and even you can make the argument that we still can, but for so long that we could, and they could get away with anything. Like you just said, we didn't have phones. You know, of course, Rodney King, like you said, I mean, no one would have known about it if someone wasn't there to record it. And that was one of the first times it really happened. And that's why it was such a huge deal. So people need to understand that we can't, you know, for Black people to act a certain way or behave around police officers, I'm like, you have to understand that those are public servants that have not served our community since the creation of police. By the way, in the South, they were slave patrols at first. So to try to understand the relationship between the Black community and the police, you have to understand the history that's behind it and the implication behind it. And so that's trauma. That, like we just talked about, my parents had to talk to me. My grandparents talked to my parents, and of course there's probably some, white families that might have had that same conversation, but I guarantee you it's not the same conversation that my dad had. My dad told me that you're a Black male, and guess what? That's what they're going to see first.
And I think that response goes to how we live day to day. Like our day to day, if they think, oh, they don't care about their environment, as Eka said, that's our trauma response. Why would I build something up if you're going to tear it down? If other communities can come in and take over our stores, take over our streets, we can't get good education, why do we care? That goes back to like communal trauma. And it's just a cycle of, generational trauma we're trying to break, that we want more. And that's hurtful.
Yeah.
And Brian, you brought up an interesting topic, because you're Black and white, right?
Yep.
So how did that conversation go with like both sides of your family? So
it's interesting, man, because I always say this: there's also a privilege for being light-skinned, and I said that there's a light-skinned privilege. I am seen as less threatening as a darker skinned Black person. And so I also take that in consideration and make sure that, that's the biggest thing with privilege, is that if you understand and you acknowledge you have your privilege, you can use it, for good. Like use your privilege as a positive thing. And that's why I'm so outspoken, specifically because of colorism, that, I understand that I'm in a position where I am in less danger as, like I said, someone who is darker skinned than I am. Now, at the end of the day, I got dreads and I look Black, and sometimes I look Arab, and that kind of doesn't help either. So like, but on my white family members, they are just as supportive. I mean, that's not with every family, but they reach out to some of the other members of my family that are darker and ask, like, what can we do? And because I've told them, like, if you're white and you're in my family, you share the last name as me, use your privilege to help out, be an ally. And this is the thing about being an ally is not hijacking the narrative. It's not hijacking the movement. It's making sure that there's no obstacles in the way of the movement, and you sit back on the sidelines and you're called in whenever you need to be called in. That's what an ally is. And so that's the conversations that I have with some of my cousins, or my, my lighter skinned aunties and uncles and things like that. That's how we have that conversation in my family, at least.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting. Just to hear, that there are some families that are white that do talk about that. I remember seeing a video on social media with a white girl telling her mom, that she's ignorant for not understanding the things that Black people go through, with police. So that brings me to my next question. Do you think people that are not of color, do they experience racial trauma or cultural trauma as well?
Yeah, they do. Maybe not the same rate as Black people. I mean, every minority group in this country has been oppressed at least once or twice, or it still is. So, I mean, I think the best next example would be the Hispanic community. I think that the Trump administration has definitely ostracized them to the point where they look like enemies of the state, basically. There's people who say that they're coming in, bringing in rapists, bringing in crime. I mean, they've been ostracized. And even now with Asian crime and Asian hate, we're seeing that because of the pandemic. So, I mean, every minority group in this country has and still is being oppressed in some way, some shape or form. We talk about, Black and brown people right now just because, of course, of police brutality, and I don't want to, I don't like comparing people's struggles because they're different. But, highlighting one's, situation like Asian crime, or highlighting another one like, Hispanic immigration and things like that, those are tenets, those are pieces of an overall racial system that's still subjugating pretty much anyone that's not a white male in this country. I'm just be point blank with it.
No,
So you gotta, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I definitely agree. We can literally go down the list and just point out every ethnicity that has been discriminated in this country, and it's different time frames. And I mean, granted, African Americans have the longest history, but
yes,
there's different moments. Like we have, it's mind blowing that one ethnicity just feels that superior that they can just degrade everyone else.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
and go ahead, Brian.
No, go ahead, Cecil.
Oh, I was just going to talk about treatment. Like, what are some ways to treat and or cope?
What I've been doing with my clients is just them, setting their boundaries, because a lot of them have been in positions like in their companies to where, every company now wants you to do cultural competency and ethnic inclusion. And there's like these different, groups that are at different companies now that are, targeting things to bring in more diversity. And, every company has a different name for it. But I've been informing my clients, or encouraging them rather, to set boundaries, like, not feeling like you need to be the example, because that's what the positions that they've been put in. Like, okay, can you teach us? Can you educate us? And not that we shouldn't, because we want to educate, we want to be the voice of reason, and we want to put these things out there so that people can understand. But it also gets draining. We get drained having to talk about the same things, like, and having to talk about conversations that we think, why should I have to tell you that it's unfair that this man gets off on these crimes and this man goes to jail? Like, why do I have to explain that? The law is the law. It shouldn't matter. So those type of things, have been really overwhelming for like a lot of people that I've been working with in their positions and their careers. So I've saying, hey, if it's not going to do something to like make you lose your job, of course, and not to be, insubordinate, but, set your boundaries and talk about what you're comfortable with, talk about what you're uncomfortable with, and being in that position to have to even share this, your narrative. And also, when you're getting home from work, kind of taking some time away from social media, taking some time away from the news, because again, like I said, the things that we see in social media are just the things that everyone's seeing, but we see our own things in our own communities on top of that. So if you happen to go back into that community, you get off the computer, you get off the phone from doom scrolling, and then you go outside your home and have the same thing happening, so you need to find a balance, and so something has to give. So let me step away from social media because I'm already in the house, I'm already in the community, I already hear the cops and what's going on next door, so I don't need more to intensify my reality.
I can piggyback on that. You can also journal, practice deep breathing exercise, practice grounding techniques. So that's like listing 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. You could talk to a friend. You can utilize meditation, yoga, just have group involvement. Don't isolate, being around people that also understand the journey so you can have that outlet to talk. And always talking to a professional can help. And you can always choose to talk to a minority professional. I think that's very important that we highlight.
Definitely. That's why we created MPN, because a lot of people say, I want to talk to somebody that understands my struggle, understands me. And we definitely make sure that we highlight minority mental health professionals and advocates, so that way we can have this conversation and they feel comfortable having it. So, yeah. Anything you want to add, O'Neal, before we close?
Not really, man. I mean, I appreciate y'all. Y'all gave so much good insight. This is a conversation that could probably be had for another 30 minutes to an hour. I think that unfortunately we'll probably see some of these topics come up again. It's inevitable. But just my last tidbit, I guess I would say, is just, we got to make sure that our intentions are positive in terms of what, how we deal with this trauma, make sure that we're there. What I've tried to do, at least, and I'm sure y'all have done the same, is just reach out to, your friends and things like that. Just ask them, you good? You know what I mean? Are you okay? Sincerely. So I think that collectively, doing that as a community, just reaching out to your neighbor, just being, have a more community mindset, reaching out to your neighbor, to your teacher, just making sure that everyone's okay, especially when certain things happen. So yeah, that's all I got to say. I appreciate y'all.
Yes, thank you all for joining. Really, really excited that we got to have this conversation again, because it's needed. We can have it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. We have to highlight it. We have to get it out there, because people need to know what is on in our community and within our racial group, because we're fed up, we're tired of it. And it definitely has made an effect on us, our parents, our future kids, our kids, something has to be done. Something has to change. So with that being said, thank you so much for attending and being a part of this podcast. And we will see you guys next time. Bye.
Thank you.